Canada's industry minister says tariffs on China will remain in place despite some concerns from the provinces. In October, Canada joined Washington in imposing 100% import taxes on Chinese electric vehicles.
So the federal government's ongoing trade dispute with China, a new Angus Reid Institute survey suggests Canadians are in favor of cutting tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles.
Canada, it's picking a battle with China. Ottawa has imposed a 100% tariff on Chinese EVs, that's electric vehicles.
Factories are slowing, fields are falling quiet, and tension is spreading from boardrooms to barns. Canada's decision to block cheap Chinese electric vehicles was meant to protect its own industries, but the backlash has been far deeper than anyone expected. Beijing retaliated with steep tariffs on Canadian canola, leaving farmers facing collapsing prices and uncertain futures. The ripple effects have now reached Ottawa, where leaders are divided, industries restless, and the public increasingly uneasy. What began as an effort to secure Canada's economic independence has spiraled into a crisis that tests the limits of the country's resolve that in late 2024, Ottawa implemented a sweeping 100% tariff on Chinese-made electric vehicles. The move was hailed as bold and necessary, a way to defend Canadian automakers from being overrun by China's aggressive EV expansion. Policymakers argued that Chinese manufacturers benefited from heavy state subsidies, creating an uneven playing field. Without decisive action, Canada's domestic car industry risked being crushed under a flood of cheap imports. The goal was to give local producers room to innovate, grow, and compete on fairer terms in a rapidly changing global market. For a brief moment, the strategy appeared to work. Supporters praised the government for standing up to Beijing and defending Canadian jobs. Yet, trade wars rarely stay contained. Within months, China responded with surgical precision, targeting sectors far removed from the auto industry. It imposed a 75.8% tariff on Canadian canola, one of the country's most vital agricultural exports, and extended duties to peas and grains. The retaliation struck at the core of the prairie economy, where countless farmers rely on Chinese markets to keep their operations viable. The consequences were immediate. Prices plummeted, export contract evaporated, and storage facilities overflowed with unsold crops. What had started as a battle over cars had evolved into a full-blown economic collision, ensnaring farmers and manufacturers alike. While Ottawa initially projected confidence, insisting the tariff was non-negotiable, cracks soon began to show. The government's message of long-term protection grew harder to defend as short-term pain deepened. Across Saskatchewan and Alberta, frustration turned to alarm. Farmers gathered in community halls and town meetings, demanding action as incomes fell and debt mounted. Without access to China, their single largest export destination, many saw no path forward. Their warnings carried weight not only because of their urgency, but because of the numbers behind them. The canola industry alone contributes over $40 billion annually to Canada's economy and sustains hundreds of thousands of jobs. The political cost of inaction was becoming too high to ignore. Amid the growing turmoil, provincial leaders began to break ranks. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe made headlines by flying to Beijing to reopen communication channels, a move that was initially marked as a political stunt but soon earned cautious praise from Prime Minister Mark Carney. His support hinted that Ottawa's once rigid stance might be softening. Not long after, Foreign Minister Mélanie Joly publicly acknowledged that the tariff policy was under review, suggesting Canada would explore new trade partnerships with Japan, South Korea, and Europe to ease the pressure. Agriculture Minister Heath MacDonald went further, proposing that the EV tariff itself might need adjustment. These statements mark a subtle but significant shift, from defending the tariff to managing its fallout. Yet even as officials searched for diplomatic exits, the domestic industries a policy aimed to protect began to weaken. The Canadian electric vehicle market, once a point of national pride, showed signs of strain. By mid-2025, EV sales had plunged nearly 40% compared to the previous year. Consumers grew wary as prices soared, supply chains tightened, and incentive programs were slashed. British Columbia ended its rebate program entirely, while Quebec kept its own only after public outcry. Most new models were now too costly to qualify for federal incentives, pushing electric cars out of reach for average buyers. What was meant to shield Canadian industry had instead exposed its vulnerabilities. Farmers, manufacturers, and consumers all found themselves caught in the same storm, one born from ambition but mired in consequence. As Ottawa weighs its next move, the question now is not just how far Canada can push a trade gamble, but how much more it can afford to lose. Chinese manufacturers known for producing low-cost electric vehicles packed with cutting-edge technology could have helped fill the growing gap in Canada's market. But the 100% tariff locked them out, shrinking consumer choices and slowing progress toward the country's goal of zero-emission transportation. As sales declined, the government quietly delayed its 2026 mandate on zero-emission vehicles and offered temporary financial aid to struggling automakers. What had begun as a policy to defend domestic growth was now dragging down innovation and eroding consumer confidence. While automakers wrestle with collapsing sales, prairie farmers continue to bear the heavier blow of China's retaliation. Across Saskatchewan and Alberta, fields of canola stood as symbols of economic uncertainty. Beijing's 75.8% tariff didn't just cut into profits, it severed access to Canada's largest export market. Prices plunged, futures markets lost confidence, and silos overflowed with grain that could no longer move overseas. For rural communities, canola wasn't merely a crop, it was a foundation of their livelihoods. From small equipment dealers to local truckers, every layer of the regional economy depended on that trade flow. Losing it meant far more than lost income. It meant questioning whether family farm could even survive another season. Ottawa pledged support, promising relief funds and trade diversification, but patience in the prairies quickly thinned. Words and press conferences could not pay off loans or clear unsold bushels. Agriculture Minister Keith MacDonald outlined new assistance programs, while Prime Minister Mark Carney pointed to Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe's outreach to Beijing as a sign of progress. Yet for many farmers, those gestures rang hollow. They believed their livelihoods had been sacrificed to protect automakers hundreds of miles away. What they wanted wasn't another bailout. It was their market back. Each passing month without a breakthrough deepened the divide between urban industry and rural economy. Ottawa faced a mounting dilemma: double down or pivot. Lifting the tariff entirely could deliver immediate relief, restoring Chinese demand for Canadian crops and making electric vehicles affordable again. It could revive consumer confidence and steady the auto market. But such a move carried serious political and economic risks. Domestic automakers, already struggling to compete with American and Asian rivals, warned they could be wiped out by a flood of cheap Chinese imports. Keeping the tariff, however, risked continued losses and an intensifying public backlash. The government found itself trapped between protecting a future-focused industry and rescuing communities in crisis. Amid the growing tension, a third option began to take shape: a selective rollback tied to new trade deals. Ottawa could reduce tariffs on certain EV models while securing improved access to Canadian crops. It could also use tariff relief as leverage, encouraging Chinese automakers to build local assembly plants or battery facilities in Canada. Such investment could create jobs, restore export markets, and reduce reliance on a single trading partner. Foreign Minister Melanie Joly hinted at this balanced approach, stressing that any concession must yield tangible economic gains. Yet even this middle ground stirred political unease. Ontario's powerful auto unions warned that reopening the door to Chinese EVs could threaten local jobs, while opposition leaders accused the government of caving under pressure. In the end, Canada stood at a crossroads, caught between principle and pragmatism, with no clear path that didn't carry a cost. Analysts questioned whether Beijing would negotiate in good faith, yet the potential benefits of renewed engagement were impossible to ignore. Reopening trade could lift farm incomes, restore consumer confidence, and reinvigorate the electric vehicle sector through healthy competition. The challenge lay in execution: how to act without appearing weak, and how to balance two powerful but opposing priorities. By the fall of 2025, Canada's economic crossroads was no longer theoretical. Every decision carried visible, often painful, consequences. Holding firm on tariffs meant more layoffs, shrinking exports, and rising public frustration. Shifting toward compromise offered the promise of recovery, but demanded political courage and precise diplomacy. Some economists argued that the tariff had at least met its short-term goal. It bought time for domestic automakers to adapt to global competition. But that time, they said, had not been used wisely. Canadian factories remained behind in technology, electric vehicle adoption slowed dramatically, and farmers continued to bear the cost of China's retaliation. Rural communities were being reshaped by economic stress that reached far beyond the prairies. What began as a bold bid for self-reliance now risked becoming a costly stalemate. The government's next move would determine whether this moment became a misstep or a turning point. A smarter strategy, analysts suggested, would tie tariff relief to measurable outcomes: renewed access to Chinese markets, firm commitments from automakers to build and innovate within Canada, and expanded partnerships with allies such as Japan and South Korea. By transforming a trade dispute into a comprehensive industrial plan, Canada could strengthen its economy and reduce its dependence on any single partner. But mishandled, the standoff could leave long-lasting economic divisions that scar the country for decades. The balance between recovery and resilience now hung in the air, its outcome poised to shape both factories and farms alike. Then, in early 2025, an unexpected challenge erupted south of the border. Relations between Washington and Ottawa took a sudden and hostile turn. The tone from the White House shifted from tension to outright confrontation. President Donald Trump's remarks about Canada grew sharper, no longer mere campaign rhetoric, but calculated provocation. He mocked Canadian sovereignty, declaring the country will be better off as America's 51st state. Within weeks, his administration followed those words with sweeping 35% tariffs on nearly all Canadian exports. These measures were not framed as negotiation tactics, but as punishment. The situation worsened when Washington accused Canada of fueling America's fentanyl crisis, a claim that U.S. officials themselves had previously dismissed. Each new insult and policy escalation struck not just at Canada's economy, but at its national pride. For generations, the relationship between the two neighbors had been among the closest in the world, anchored in trust, shared values, and open trade. Now that friendship was unraveling under the weight of politics, leaving Canada to navigate a storm of external pressure and internal division at the same time.